Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I'm going to kind of throw a thought experiment at all of you, and I'm going to ask you to stop and think about before you get into this video of what is full range of motion. I want you to stop and think about that as you watch, because you're going to watch my deadlift here, and everyone's going to say, yeah, that's full range of motion. Of course, people will say, but Jason, you have long arms, and your average height. Well, what do you mean by that? Meaning I'm exactly 5'9", which is 6 foot in internet standards. That's my barefoot measured by a doctor in their office. Most guys add 3 inches to their height. So, and I have a 6 foot wingspan. Okay. So people say, well, you have longer arms than average, so therefore you're going to be a little better at deadlift because you have a shorter range of motion. Okay. So what is range of motion then? Was that a full range of motion lift, or is this a full range of motion lift? Right. A 1 inch deficit. It's like, oh, well, I pulled 615 there. I missed this 615, by the way. I missed it. I can't quite lock it. Missed the lockout. But I've added an inch to the range of motion. What's full range of motion? Is this it? I guess it is. I guess it's full range of motion on a 1 inch deficit. So I guess the deadlift is kind of a ill-defined range of motion, but I couldn't get that one. I couldn't get the lockout. I missed it. Well, how's this for full range of motion? What about next? Okay, that's with a 1 inch deficit. Is that full range of motion? A lot of people say sure. How about a 2.5 inch? We added another 1.5 inches. By the way, we would count this lift roughly, but did I get full range of motion? My lockout's a little soft. I should have locked it an inch harder. I moved it 1.5 inches further than the conventional though. Right? Because it's 2.5 inch deficit, and I really kind of just soft locked it. Right? So I kind of missed the last inch. I didn't lock back. But it was still a longer range of motion than the normal. This is 575. Right, but you see that? That was a soft lock. Okay. Was that full range of motion? How about bench press? We know bench press range of motion is when you touch your chest. But you know what? We have different length arms. We have different size chests. Do we judge it by joint angle? Because then people will go over to dumbbells and stuff. So what's full range of motion with a dumbbell? It's full range of motion with a dip. Do you go so low that it hurts? So we have to think in terms of joint angles. We have to think in terms of range of motion on an exercise. And that's why I'm a big fan of exercises that have terminal controlled range of motion. That's why I like deadlifts. That's why I like box squats. That's why I like bench presses, because we can define these. We can clearly define what our range of motion is for programming purposes for consistency. So is that full range of motion for a close grip bench? Or is this full range of motion? I'm adding another inch with the buffalo bar, right? Because that point where my hands are going to be for the close grip, my hands are going to be an inch lower. It gets an inch lower relative to my chest. So was the other full range of motion, or is this? And since this is actually a little hard on my shoulders, is this even an appropriate range of motion? I sometimes get a little bit of shoulder irritation with this bar. If I go with a wider grip, my shoulders might hurt for 3 days. Did we go to an excessive range of motion at that point? I would argue that we did. So if I take my hands out wider and it brings that even deeper and I get 2 inches lower than that, it actually hurts my shoulders. So what is full range of motion when the bar stops? So is this board press full range of motion? I have a way to stop the bar completely. Taking 5 inches out of the range of motion with a four-board. It's half of what the other bench was, right? But is this full range of motion? Pressed into the chest? Well, for purposes of the exercise it is. For the joint it clearly isn't. But we have to stop and think about these things. And I'll get to that further in a minute of how we should really define range of motion. Well, we should always define it on an exercise as what the exercise allows for, right? We clearly see that on all of that pressing. All of that pulling, right? We have clearly defined ranges of motion set by the exercise. And if we're going to do an exercise, we need to use tools that set our correct range of motion. Okay, but this what's full range of motion? When I touch my chest, right? This point, just my low chest. And when it touches the floor. And when I touch the floor, because of my position, I have scapular protraction. My lats spread apart. So technically, they're not going to really go much lower because I'm actively spreading them and setting a torso position for that. So this is fairly terminal. Well, what about an inverted row? People say, well, your bar should touch the chest. Really? Mine can't. And I can do like 20 of these nonstop. I can't touch my bar the bar to my chest. Why? I have a 6-foot wingspan. I have slightly longer than average arms. Okay. I can only get the bar about 1 inch from my chest. And how do we define what the range of motion is? People say, well, you need to pull yourself further up. Well, why? My scapula touch. Okay. My scapula touch, they're completely retracted when I'm at the top of that. Well, that is full range of motion, but in that case, the bar can't define it. My scapula, my actual physical joints have to define the range of motion. I'm stretched at the bottom and I'm completely contracted at the top. My joints in that case define the range of motion at that angle. What about this box squat I just did? Well, we define the range of motion by the box, but how do you define it on a back squat? Parallel? Full squat? A parallel squat isn't a full range of motion. Now, it only is on this box squat because I set the box at 11 inches. What about when I do a 12-inch box instead? Those are 1-inch thick mats. I can do a 10-inch, 11-inch, a 12-inch, a 13, a 14, whatever I need to do. I can set the exact range of motion on the box squat. In this case, I am well below parallel on the 11. 12 inches below parallel for me, too. So, full range of motion on a squat is called a full squat. And a lot of people can't do a full squat without risking their low back. A lot of people, when they do a full squat, they get so much rounding in the low back that it actually hurts them. It can cause injuries. So should we be defining range of motion as the full range of motion of the joint or our safe, effective range of motion? Okay, when we have an exercise that doesn't have terminal things to prevent it, like we know the joint locks at the top, in the box squat we touch the bottom. Deadlift we touch the ground. The bench press we touch our chest. What about a dip? I'm actually getting a deeper stretch here than I do on a bench press. What's full range of motion? Well, the full range of motion for a dip will destroy your shoulder joints, particularly if you're not really young. At my age, in my 40s, if I were to go as far down as the joint would go, I would possibly rip something. And if I don't rip something, I'm going to get very severe inflammation very quickly and I wouldn't be able to press at all. So for me, it's what, about parallel? I have a deep stretch on my chest at that point. The pec isn't really going to stretch much further than that, though, isn't it? At that point, it's just going to be all that shoulder travel, rotation of the shoulder, which can actually damage it, especially under load, right? Because if you can't stretch yourself further back than that with a light load, if you're forcing yourself to go that deep because of body weight and plates added to get that stretch, what's happening? You're putting yourself into a weighted stretch that isn't your normal mobility or range of motion of your joint for you. Even though the joint can physically do it, your musculature can't. So what's going to happen? You tear stuff. Or you get very serious inflammation. So what I would argue is that range of motion is actually quite ambiguous. And I'm not saying that people should be doing a bunch of half reps because I said that. You have to have some common sense. We know that outside of specific specificity of training benefits, like my board presses, I do them for very specific reasons. But if you came to me and said, is the board press the best way to blow up your pecs and triceps? Well, I'd say probably not. Wouldn't probably be the fastest way to put a bunch of size on. It has some joint angle specificity with carryover, especially for getting used to handling very heavy weights, like being able to rep your 1 rep max for half reps. To get more workload with that through a sticking point, that could have some performance value. Is it ideal for size? Of course not. Because longer ranges of motion are generally superior for hypertrophy, aren't they? Assuming we don't get hurt doing them. Assuming we don't get inflammation doing them. So outside of the context of a specific exercise to where we have very specific, clearly defined terminal ranges of motion, range of motion really is going to be subjective based upon your individual joints. It's going to be subjective based upon your individual musculature, isn't it? It's going to be a little different. It's more ambiguous than we would make it out to be. And it's not, for half reps. We're talking about for that. What's the difference between 1 inch, 2 inch? 2 inches could be the difference between two people as far as their articulation of their joints. Same thing, you guys would look at that inverted row. My scapula touch when I get to that point at the high angle. Now, if I'm pulling low to my chest on a row off the floor, it's a different angle. I can pull them together and touch my chest. But from that angle, my scapula touch, I can't go any higher. Right? My lats won't actually contract. I would have to use other muscles to pull myself up because the lats have completed their full range of motion. Those muscles won't go further. So again, range of motion isn't always clearly defined at the terminal ends. It's going to vary. It's something that we need to be aware of in training ourselves and following our own training programming to track progress, because we have to be consistent in our range of motion to track progress and overload. And when we're coaches, we have to be aware of anatomical differences person to person. Okay, it's more ambiguous than you would think it is. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.